But what you can't do is say, I'm going to create a market, an economy, and then I'm just going to take out the public authority. It doesn't work. There's the actual market itself is a creature of public governance, even though we don't often think of it that way.
Hello and welcome to WooStream, bringing Willamette to you. My name's Tiffany Newton and I lead the Alumni and Parent Engagement team here at Willamette University. Today's conversation features Rohan Gray, Assistant Professor of Law at Willamette University's College of Law. Professor Gray's research focuses on the legal design and regulation of money and finance, including digital fiat currency, as well as broader issues of law and political economy. He teaches contracts, business organizations, security regulations, and a new course, Law, Money, Technology. He earned his JD from Columbia Law School, an LLM from the London School of Economics, and was a doctoral fellow at Cornell Law School prior to coming to Willamette. Today, Professor Gray will guide us through the largely uncharted digital financial landscape, including the evolving area of law around digital fiat currency, cryptocurrency, and NFTs, non-fungible tokens for those who don't know, and how your financial life may be impacted by all of the above. We'll talk about all of this, but now join me in welcoming Professor Gray.
Thank you very much for having me.
So to just start things off, I provided a very brief introduction of what you teach at Willamette, your educational background, research interests, those kinds of things. But could you tell us a little bit more about how you got into the field of digital currencies and financial structures and why that's kept your research focus and interest for a while now?
Yeah, I actually was a music teacher before law school and got into law school originally intending to do education policy and was a children's attorney after law school for a number of years in custody and visitation, abuse, and neglect cases where I like to say I didn't litigate a single dollar. I litigated other things, but never money. But my interest in money really sort of started with the global financial crisis. I went to university sort of right at the epicenter of that crisis, and I went overseas to the United States on exchange and never really left. But I was on exchange at the University of Pennsylvania with friends of mine there who I met through the Debate Society, who went on to work on Wall Street and who were at Wharton Business School. And I was trying to make sense of what had just happened, this sort of cataclysmic moment that had sort of broken the entire global economy, and had studied political economy in undergraduate, not the standard sort of economics where there's a lot of maths and curves, but looking at the actual social structures and the social relationships. And when I would speak with these people who were sort of then going on to work on Wall Street, it became very clear that, understanding the real nuts and bolts, the real kind of intricate details of how money and finance worked was really essential to understanding how the global economy worked. And if you didn't do that, then it didn't matter whether what you're interested in was music education or helping children or families in poverty or whatever else, that eventually these large systems would come to bear down on you. And so, in a different world, maybe I would still be doing that other work. But it became clear to me over time that this was the area that I could contribute the most in. And after a few years of practicing and really being involved in these conversations around monetary design and macroeconomic policy, kind of almost as a night job, it became clear to me I couldn't keep up both to a kind of high standard. And so I made the switch permanently into this work. And since then, I've had the opportunity to work with policymakers in Congress and social movement organizations and other academics to try to bring about a whole new way of thinking about money and to lean into some of the questions that are now at the forefront of the public debate that maybe 5, 7, 8 years ago were seen as somewhat fringe or somewhat esoteric.
I appreciate that. Now, I know some of us, myself included, are still learning about what all of this means, how that plays out in our own lives, how we're impacted. So I'm wondering if you could, and forgive me for saying this, talk to me like I'm in second grade and just explain a bit about, why we have something other than the dollar, why we have these digital financial structures, systems, policies, if you could.
Yeah, and let's see how I go. I used to be an elementary school teacher. Let's see how I go. The first thing is that we've had all sorts of monies throughout history, often at the same time. We sometimes think of money as just one thing, right? Obviously, there's coins and notes in our pocket that all kind of look the same. But there were periods in history where there were all kinds of notes and coins that operated next to each other. And if you kind of zoom out a little bit or pay a little bit close attention, there's all kinds of money today, even if we might not even think of it as such. When you get a Starbucks gift card, you can use that to pay for things. When you get a Subway token, you can use that to pay for things. If you're in the financial markets, you might be using debt or certain kinds of securities, certain kinds of financial instruments as a form of money. And if you're, in places where there might not be a very advanced banking system, but there is, for example, a very developed cell phone network system, then you might be actually using things like airtime minutes as a form of money. So one of the monetary economists that I like, who I learned a lot from, the late Hyman Minsky, used to have a great line which I really, sort of stuck with me and find very useful, is he used to say, anyone can create money. The challenge is to get it accepted. And it's a great line because it both shows that there is this sort of not a single monoculture, but a real biodiversity of money, a real kind of pluralism going on. But also it really asks us that question of why is it that some monies are more, significant than others, more important than others. And just to give a small example, I actually lived in Ithaca, New York before this. And Ithaca is one of the cities in the United States that's famous for issuing its own complementary currency called the Ithaca Hour, where people would contribute hours of time and they'd get these paper notes that people in town would accept as payment. There was a number of sort of participating businesses, so that was their acceptance theory. But of course, the US dollar was still much more prominent there. And the question becomes, why is it that the US dollar rather than the Ithaca Hour is still the dominant currency even in a town like Ithaca? And the answer is because the US dollar is intimately connected to the system of governance and the system of law that comprises the broader United States system. We not only pay our taxes in US dollars, but we also pay fees and fines and court judgments and anything that might end up through the courts or even have some risk of legal enforcement usually ends up requiring the kind of money that the government will recognize. And so that's a very obvious and clear starting point to understand why it is that over time, over history, there's always been a very close relationship between money and legal and governmental power. It's because those two things are intimately connected. And that old joke, there's only two things in life that are certain, death and taxes. Well, there's only two things in a monetary system that are important, and that is, who gets to issue it and who gets to force you to use it. And often those two are the same actor. But even today, we think of the US dollar as one single monolithic thing, but the vast majority of dollars that you and I interact with on a daily basis are not issued by the mint or the Bureau of Engraving and Printing at Treasury. They're not paper currency. They're not coins. They're digital entries in a computer, and that computer is usually managed by a bank or a credit union. And those are not representations of dollars sitting in a vault. There's not a sort of gold bars or gold coins or some sort of Harry Potter kind of scenario where the dollars in your bank account are one-to-one matched by something. Rather, they are issued by banks and guaranteed by the United States. Almost sort of like if you were to, try and buy a house and your parents co-signed your mortgage, right? The act of validating the bank's IOUs as good as money, as good as public money, is what makes them money. And so even today, even within the US dollar system, there is this hierarchy that has, public officials, public authorities at the top, and then the actors that they deputize, what my old advisor used to call a franchise model, kind of like, McDonald's would allow you to use the McDonald's logo for your restaurant. And then there's, all the way down to you and I, who might issue IOUs that nobody really wants to use as money, or at least they didn't until we added the word, tech beforehand. And now things are maybe a little bit starting to be different.
Well, and it's interesting when you talk about, deputizing these different institutions, and now we have structures that seem to not really fall under any formal regulation and really outside maybe some of the purview of our own government or even international monetary entities. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about, before we get into like specific details about the different items I had listed before, why we should really care and be mindful of this issue as all of these new products and things are being marketed to us. You can buy them in an app, and there's all of these social media, trends of around different stocks, different things. If you could talk a little bit about that, why it matters from an individual standpoint before we get into the specifics.
Yeah, sure. And I always like this quote by the poet Rainer Marie Rilke, and it wasn't really about law in the way that I teach law. He was making a comment about biological law, but I like it anyway. I kind of steal it for our purposes. He says, "Don't be confused by the surfaces. In the depths, everything becomes law." And I don't know if I go that far in all parts of life, but often people think there isn't a legal structure underneath. There isn't some sort of legal regulation that applies. But that's often because we're not looking in the right place, or we're not looking deep enough, or the people on the other side want to give an impression that there isn't a relevant legal regime. And so, for example, when it comes to things like multinational corporations, they still have to be chartered. They still have to be subject to jurisdiction. They still have to have a governance structure that can be regulated. And the same is true with various monetary institutions, whether those are what we would call crypto today, or whether it's traditional banks and things. There is a place, there is a location, legally speaking, where we can identify the people in charge, the people running the thing. And often it's very tempting to believe the hype that there is this sort of decentralization. There's nobody in charge. But often, it's actually a little bit more like a Scooby-Doo mystery, where you think there's a ghost, and then you pull back the veil, and there's actually sort of just a regular guy underneath trying to avoid taxes on his theme park or something. And often when you try to pull back the veil on these decentralized networks, it turns out there are very powerful players, there are very established actors, and there's a lot of legal enforcement underneath the narrative that they are sort of completely anarchic. But the other thing is that this history of sort of the digitization of money and how it changes everything, actually begins quite a long time ago. It doesn't begin in 2010. It doesn't begin in even 1985, the internet or something. It goes all the way back to the 1830s with the invention of the telegraph, when we first started sort of connecting people by very long distances with electrical cables. And within decades, by the 1850s, there was wire transfers going that were allowing markets and traders and financial institutions across the Atlantic, who may have taken weeks beforehand to communicate almost instantaneously. And it wasn't for a while and after that until we started actually building databases and computers to store the information. Early on, it was just sort of like two people with a can up against their ear and a cable, and the cable happened to be made of electricity, so it was a lot faster. But by the time you get to sort of the mid-20th century, you're starting to actually digitize the payment system itself, not just the communications cables. And then you have, of course, telephone banking and the early forms of internet banking. And at each step of the process, new actors, new entrants into the financial system came from the edges. They came from the margins and used their technological edge to muscle their way in. The banking industry is pretty conservative. It's pretty, traditional. It's sort of got those old tall black hats from a Mary Poppins movie or something. And so they don't like to let in new people when they can avoid it. They are pretty kind of closed and protectionist. And historically, the biggest way that we have changed the structure of the financial system and allowed for a disruption of existing interests was through technological innovation. It was through kind of sweeping the board, starting afresh with a different set of rules, and in that process, allowing for a power shuffle. Not always in a more egalitarian way, not in a way that necessarily helps average people, but that kind of disruption is not new. It's not the first time we're experiencing it today. It just happens to be a particularly important one because we are doing, I think, now the kind of fundamental digitization that we haven't done up until now. We've digitized different bits and pieces, but this is really building from first principles a digitally native monetary system. And the decisions we make now have the potential to reverberate for decades afterwards. But it's not a new dynamic in the broader sense.
I appreciate that historical viewpoint and really kind of bringing us up to now and letting us know that, it's kind of a reinvention of the wheel and not always something that's completely outside of human experience. Um, we do have a question that's related that I kind of want to throw in here. Does that mean that in the early days, Western Union was the original digital currency? By that, I mean dots and dashes could be considered today's zeros and ones.
Absolutely, absolutely. In fact, Western Union was one of the first actors to issue the first kind of charge card that became the modern credit card, which is still the sort of backbone of international traditional payments. And it wasn't until the sort of mid 20th century that what we consider the sort of original precursors of the credit card, the Diners Club Express and Amex and things, came to the forefront. But long before that, it was Western Union. It was precisely because of their dominance in the payments architecture. And in fact, ironically, when the Federal Reserve was established in 1913, they used Western Union's pipes. Why? Because they didn't have any of their own. Up until that point, the single probably largest public information communication infrastructure was the Postal Service. It's the largest employer in the federal government. It provided subsidized communications so that people could send, political information, etc. It was the lifeblood of this massive new continental empire that was being constructed. But they sort of shied away from investing in their own digital infrastructure. I think, perhaps unfortunately, because when the time came to build, a public central banking network, we didn't have the capacity. And there are parallels to that today, frankly. There are parallels to these questions of kind of, if we are to build a digital dollar, which is something that has shifted from the very far future or the very kind of edges of possibility right into center stage, in part, again, due to the interventions of large tech companies like Facebook and Amazon and Google into the payments space. And before that, of course, PayPal famously, that launched the careers of Elon Musk and Peter Thiel and all these other tech oligarchs nowadays. But yes, it was really a kind of intentional process of not building public infrastructure. And now, when the time comes to debate having a digital dollar, we are looking to third parties to build that infrastructure and to create the kinds of public-private partnerships which I think many people are souring on more broadly, not because they're necessarily the best way to build, but because we have spent so long convincing ourselves we can't build robust infrastructure, that the idea that the Postal Service, could start getting into financial services like it's recently done, or that we could build a robust system of public banks or public bank accounts or a digital cash card that could be widely available the way that prepaid cards are available, sounds like it's sort of almost a sci-fi story. It's almost, we can't even get the fresh water in the pipes. So you're telling me we're going to build a whole public financial system? But it's not an impossible thing. It simply requires a different kind of approach to public goods than we have been pursuing for the last several decades.
So that's really interesting because it kind of shows that we've used, in a capitalist society, private actors to meet social, public needs, and where the ethic discussion could be within that, or other things that we could discuss. But I'm wondering if we can pivot slightly into that buzzwords conversation and just share what some of the current products are that we all hear about, or the current discussion topics. So if you could talk a little bit about, what is cryptocurrency? What is digital fiat currency? What are NFTs? Those kinds of things.
Sure. Let's see if I can do it in 20 seconds a pop. No, cryptocurrency, is a wide term now. It generally kind of refers to the whole industry in one sense, and it's usually often referred to in sort of shorthand for a whole range of privately issued currencies. So, I said before that anyone can create currency, money. The challenge is to get it accepted. Well, not all money is equal, obviously, and there are certain kinds of monies that are either issued by public authorities or recognized as equivalent by public authorities, that kind of deputization or franchise model that I mentioned. But then there are also a bunch of private currencies, whether that's Bitcoin or Ithaca Hours or the Swiss WIA system, which is an industry currency that different actors in a supply chain use with each other as a way to kind of give each other credit along the supply chain without the need for additional financing from elsewhere. And cryptocurrency has become a kind of catch-all term nowadays for any private currency that uses sort of novel financial technology. But the term, more technically refers to the use of specifically cryptographic techniques to secure the currency, to create, prohibitions against double spending, and to substitute for the kind of trust that in the past would have rested with legal institutions or public authorities or some sort of central counterparty. That old kind of in God we trust, everybody else bring cash. Well, in the past it might have been in public institutions, everybody else bring cryptography. That might be how we could think of it. And whether that's very traditional forms of cryptography, where things like what they call public key encryption that undergirds a lot of the internet, not necessarily novel cryptography, or much more cutting edge techniques like what they call homomorphic encryption, where you can basically analyze what's going on inside encrypted data without ever actually decrypting it. So I could say, I've got data that has my driver's license information, and you can never see it, but you can ask that data whether or not I'm over 21. And it can tell you yes without ever actually telling you my date of birth. Those kinds of things are pretty novel, and they allow for new forms of transaction and new forms of interaction in a digital world. But I just want to go back one quickly, because you asked about how this might affect individuals, and I don't think I gave a perfectly good answer. So I want to just say, I think one big implication here is we are the last generation that will live between the transition of, analog money and purely digital money. There may be some form of physical cash in the future. I hope there will be. But most children, most people growing up from now will experience a world where digital money is the default and cash may be a rare moment of exception. And how we understand our relationship to that money. Do we think that money is sending information back to central command every time we make a transaction? Do we think that money is something that we have to ask permission to use so that somebody can always say, no, you can't make that transaction? Do we think of that money as something that is a public good, or is that it's something that's created by markets or by private actors? Do we think its value lies in its legal power, or in the fact that it's sort of a digital version of gold or something like that? Those are the kinds of questions that we are going to be answering this generation, and it will have reverberations for everybody that grows up after this. So we are in a kind of historical inflection point. And the decisions we make collectively now don't only affect us, they affect every generation in the same way as the decisions we make about climate change today do. So that's the big stakes to me, at least. The decisions have a timeline of 3 to 5 years from now, I would say.
That's coming up quick. I mean, in the scope of things, that is a very short time period.
Yeah,
and
life comes at you fast. Yeah.
I know, especially when you don't understand what anyone's talking about about this stuff. So just going back real quick, if you could explain also, the difference.
Oh, yeah, sorry, my apology. That wasn't 20 seconds.
Yeah, no. Well, and we'll get back to the broader societal impact and some of those consequences of those decisions that we all, could be part of. But the digital fiat currency and NFTs, because those questions have come from alums who had had interest in this topic.
So digital fiat currency, in contrast to cryptocurrency, is not referring to the method that it is created, and it isn't shorthand for those private currencies. It's specifically talking about public currency, but it's specifically talking about public currency that's issued directly from the sovereign or from the public authority. So as I said before, most of us, when we think of digital money in our accounts, whether that's Venmo or PayPal or our bank account, or our money market account, or whatever else, our brokerage account. Those are forms of money that are issued by private actors, often deputized, but private actors. The only forms of currency that you and I can access are coins and notes. And the only form of digital fiat currency that exists today, in a meaningful sense, is the central bank settlement balances, the central bank accounts. And the only actors that have access to those are banks. So, in some respects, this is about creating access to a digital form of money that up until now has been sort of wholesale, only for the people above us. We use banks, the banks use the central bank. This is an attempt to say, hey, maybe we can cut out the middlemen. But it also is an attempt to actually look at the idea of currency itself. And actually, there's an interesting sort of legal story when the word currency there is in part about it being owned by the current possessor. So if you steal $100 and then go to a store and buy a candy bar, and then 20 minutes later the police chase you down the road and they catch you and they notice that you've already spent some of that money, they can't go into the store and say, hey, give us back those $2 for that candy bar. If you bought that with good faith and the other person didn't know that you stole that money, it's theirs now. Money does not have a history. It's current. The current possessor has the claim, as long as it's a bona fide purchase. That is not necessarily true of account-based money that exists only as someone else's IOU on a ledger. If you have somebody steal your credit card or somebody gets your bank details and then they make a fraudulent transaction, you call up the bank and they will unwind that transaction. That doesn't happen with cash. Who do you call? You call the cash police and they say, oops, sorry, here's a fresh $100 bill for the one that you lost. No. So digital fiat currency is something deeper than just a better bank account. There's this apocryphal story attributed to Henry Ford when he was designing the car. He said, if I asked people what they wanted, they would have said a better bank account. Well, there is more to digital fiat currency than just a better bank account. It is asking that other question. What might it look like to create a currency that is directly issued by the government, directly to us, and actually may have the features and properties of physical cash. You can spend it without any third party in the middle. You can spend it without leaving a record that somebody can trace and sell that data to somebody else or can hold against you in the future. And that kind of privacy, that kind of transactional freedom is not one that we often associate with civil liberties and a kind of respect for people's privacy, but it has a real significant effect. Sex workers who can't access the banking system find it very hard to live. People who are trying to run marijuana businesses who can't access the banking system because the Federal Reserve will not allow any bank who has an account with them to do business find it very hard to operate. If you are a Palestinian activist and you're trying to get donations through PayPal or Venmo and they cancel that ability to accept transactions because they've designated you a terrorist organization, it's very hard to operate. And those are all real stories. Those are things that have really happened. And it's not just sort of people at the margins and vulnerable populations. It's often much even more fundamental to the idea of sort of civil liberties in a democratic society, things like political dissent. So one of the stories that I often refer to is a famous Supreme Court case, the NAACP versus Alabama from the 1950s, where the racist white supremacist governor of Alabama at the time, who was trying to fight against desegregation, tried to get the membership list of the NAACP, everybody that had paid membership dues, because they wanted to harass those people, unsurprisingly. And the Supreme Court said, no, you don't have the right to demand that information, even though they're a corporate entity chartered in your state, because they have a right to freedom of association, and giving up that information would make it difficult to associate. Well, of course, nowadays, why would you even need to ask them? You would just call up their bank and their bank would give that information up. And so a world in which you can't make transactions without any privacy is a world in which political dissent is very easy to crush. And that keeps me up at night. I had an old law professor who said, next time they go, he was Jewish, lost many family members in the Holocaust. He said, next time they go after my family members in Europe, and they will, they'll get every single one because they know where everywhere everybody is all the time. And that hit me like a ton of bricks when I was a law student, and I've never forgot it, because the kind of monetary questions I cared about at that point were, how can we get people with less money to have more money? How can we build a system that doesn't destroy the planet? That we can produce things that people enjoy that don't destroy the planet. And suddenly I had this whole other thing I had to think about, which is, what's the data trails we're leaving? Who's in the middle of these transactions? What does it mean to have, cash in my pocket? The cash register doesn't discriminate. I went to a big city to blend in the background because I was bullied for being gay in a small town. And now suddenly my identity is following me with my bank account. And that's sort of where I've ended up with the work that I do, is to try to sort of integrate those different dimensions into a vision for how we design future digital fiat currency. And lastly, to your question about NFTs, non-fungible tokens are basically a unique barcode or a unique address on a blockchain, which is a database that's distributed amongst people. Imagine 100 people had a shared Google Drive and they each kept a copy, and the only stuff that was in each one was the one that everyone else could agree was in each one. So the NFT is simply a unique barcode lodged at some point in that database. And people use it nowadays the way that they would use certificates of authenticity in art sales. It doesn't mean you can't copy the piece of art. It doesn't mean you have even the copyright in the piece of art. It just means you can put a certificate up on the wall that says, I have the only certificate that's associated with this artwork. And there are all sorts of interesting ways you can use that technology, but that's what it is at its core. It's a unique entry on a common distributed ledger. And when you associate that entry with someone's ID, with a piece of art, with anything else, with a video clip, then it can have value in the same way as collectible baseball cards can have value.
That's fascinating. Sorry, my brain is going between, what these different types of things that people are now investing in or purchasing, reading about in the news, versus the systems that we all interact with, but maybe aren't thinking of when we carry around a GPS, a cell phone with us at all times that tracks our financial
the largest spying machine. The most sophisticated spying machine ever created, and there's one in everybody's pockets. Yes.
Yeah. And we voluntarily give up so much information so that we can feel connected to our family and friends and, get that free appetizer at a local restaurant or whatever else we do to engage with that. And I'm wondering, to kind of dig into it a little bit, what you think the current digital financial landscape is and where it should go. You said we have 3 to 5 years when we're making these decisions about, what do we think of equity within the system? What do we think of the impact on individuals versus nations or corporations? What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, and it's interesting. I wasn't one of those people that believed that social change only happens when there's an enemy to fight. But in the last few years, between climate, between President Trump's election, and between, in my world, Facebook's announcement that they were going to create their own digital currency, I've had to reconsider that view, because for a long time, and I was working in this space since at least about 2013, when I would speak to central bankers about digital currency, digital fiat currency, and say, all this Bitcoin stuff that's out there, all this mobile money that's out there, all this internet banking that's out there, eventually the public is going to create their own, and that's going to reset the board, just like there were thousands of private banknotes in the early 1800s. And then when Lincoln created the greenback, we sort of consolidated them all and replaced them all with one single, dollar to rule them all. And these central bankers, who were never particularly radical or forward-thinking types, they're pretty moderate and incrementalist and like to not do anything until they absolutely have to. The response I would get was, yeah, this is interesting. It's probably coming, but it's not anytime soon. Or I'm not sure if we really need it. I'm not sure if the benefits outweigh the risks. And then Libra announced itself and said, we're going to, create the internet of money, and we're going to roll it out across our almost 3 billion person user base. And by the way, this is the same group of people that's continually violated your privacy and sold your data and apologized afterwards, but we'll do differently this time, we promise. And central bankers actually, I think, are a little scared about that. That was the first time I really saw a ramping up of energy. There were a few governments around the world, notably China, but a few others, including Bahamas and Ecuador, that had been ahead of the curve before that. But mid-2019, when that announcement was made, everybody really got a kick up the butt and woke up on this issue and really started to change their tune. And the conversation went from a question of if to a question of when. And the lower functionaries got the memo from higher up that the timeline is gone from 3 years to 3 months, and stuff really changed. And so, when it comes to kind of where we're at now and the questions that we're dealing with now, a lot of it is how do we lean into a future and have a vision of what's important while recognizing there's all this other stuff going on at the same time. And in my view, there's a few key kind of guiding posts that make it easy to sift through the noise, and there's plenty of noise. One is, if you want to make money, go make money. But don't convince yourself that what you're doing is building important public infrastructure. And that's fine. I have no problem with people who want to make money, but there is often a mistake where people think that what's good for them or what's good for the next kind of thing that they're riding the wave of has to have some social value. And in my experience, that's not necessarily true at all. Certainly not true when it comes to building, core financial infrastructure. So is there money to be made in the NFT world? Definitely. Is there money to be made in crypto world? Yes. There's money to be lost there too, but there's money to be made. Is that actually building, the new payments infrastructure for the future? I don't think so. And one of the reasons for that is because as a monetary theory, as a theory of how money works, it fails, in my opinion. Public money and private monies do different things. And it's a category error to try to get one to do the other. Right? It's like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. It's like trying to get a boat to fly to the moon. You're in the wrong vehicle if you're trying to get to that other place. And so when it comes to building real, genuine public infrastructure that's available for everybody, that's really designed to be universal, something like the roads, something like the water, something like the libraries, something like the schools, then you need to start from a very different perspective and starting set of assumptions than most people in the crypto space. And that leads me to digital fiat currency. But, because it's very, I don't want to have any friends, apparently. A lot of the people on the public side think that the most important priority is to build a system that prevents crime, right? The real risk is money laundering. It's, child pornography. It's drug dealing. It's terrorism. And if we are going to build a public digital currency, it should have a backdoor that the government can access, that the FBI and the NSA can access if they need to. And it should have sort of surveillance baked in, some sort of monitoring baked in. You probably need to give an ID to even get an account. Those are the things that we think are important. And I understand why from those people's points of view, right? You ask the FBI whether they think the Fourth Amendment is a good thing. Maybe they don't like it that much, right? But a lot of people who actually value their own privacy and civil liberties might not agree with that vision. Unfortunately, right now, a lot of those people are the ones leading the conversation around public money. So I end up sort of being the most sort of crypto-sounding person in the public money rooms and the most public money-sounding person in the crypto rooms, because I think that it's a mistake to try to build a public monetary system based on private monies. But I think if we are going to build a public monetary system, it should have a respect for privacy and for transactional anonymity in the way that a lot of crypto people say is a good thing. And that to me is the sweet spot. You get to piss off everybody, but it's the sweet spot in terms of the design, because we've actually done this before. We have a historical analog, and that is paper currency and coins. And I actually, in other world, in another area of my work, I spend a lot of time talking about coinage for various reasons. But I actually like coins even more than paper currency, because even paper currency has a barcode. They trace the Lindbergh baby kidnappers by the barcodes on the money. And, anyone that's seen a cop movie has, talked about tracing, stolen bank money and things. But coins are the purest symbol of private money there is. There's no barcode, right? You put it in your pocket, you can take it with you. And if somebody wants to, arrest you or surveil what you're doing, get a search warrant. I'm not saying there shouldn't be criminal enforcement. There obviously should be. Nobody likes, child pornographers and terrorists and all that kind of stuff. But the idea that every time you do something with money, that it's creating a record and that record's going to central command, I think is an extremely dangerous future. We won't even notice the harm, but it will be every child growing up just feeling a little bit less like they can do things without someone watching, a little bit less like they can take risks, right? They think twice before they type something into the Google search bar when Google admits, as it did a few days ago, that it sends certain keywords directly to the FBI. And those kinds of things, when we do it with money, when money is supposed to be the way that we unlock resources in society, you can't live in a house, you can't get on a train, you can't do anything like that. Then that to me is the value that we need to be protecting as we transition from a sort of analog centric to a digital centric monetary regime.
From my perspective, that makes sense because it also ties into some of the key factors that help make democracy work, which is where you can, hold your government to account without feeling
Right.
like you will be penalized and tracked and have your civil liberties taken advantage of. So I'm wondering from it, the individuals who maybe are still on with us who might be very worried about some of the things we've talked about,
It keeps me up at night. Yeah.
I know. How you would, kind of guide folks to become more informed about financial systems, about these kinds of things, and just stay on top of this topic for themselves, or at least be a more mindful consumer as they engage with these products.
Yeah, and as I said before, first of all, everybody's got their hustle. Everyone's got to make a living. If there's money to be made, go for it. I wish you the best of luck. But when it comes to kind of, when you're wearing your citizen's hat, when you're wearing your sort of informed member of the community hat, there's a different set of concerns and priorities we should be thinking about there. And to me, at least, the starting point is, as I said before, to recognize the difference between public and private money at a structural level. This doesn't mean I have to love the government. It doesn't have to mean I love, centralized bureaucracy, but it does mean recognizing that there is a difference between, the full faith and credit of the United States, a dollar bill that you can pay your taxes, you can go to a court when you get a court judgment and use it to satisfy your debts, and a Chuck E. Cheese token or or a Bitcoin token. They have a different legal and social purpose, and they have a different legal and social potential. One is never going to replace the other because it can't. The US dollar is the same thing that creates enforces the property rights, that creates the courts, that creates the military power. Those, you don't disentangle the money and somehow privatize it and keep all of that other stuff intact. They're intertwined. And the second part is to recognize and to be conscious of that there is a war on cash. There is a war on not just the physical currency, but the idea of cash. And this is a well-documented thing in the literature. It's a well-documented phenomenon that that whether it's sort of Visa or MasterCard or, Palantir or the NSA, that the idea that you can use money that is yours in your pocket, there is no third party, etc., is being framed as inefficient. It's being framed as dirty. There was a big campaign during the early months of the COVID pandemic to frame cash as dirty. In fact, the World Health Organization released, information saying, in our view, there's nothing inherently risky about using cash more than cards or anything else. It was completely made up propaganda. And entities like the Gates Foundation are pushing for what they call financial inclusion in sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere, which really means let's get everybody a digital account that we can then track and analyze the data from. And these guys, they're quite explicit about this. There's a thing called the Better Than Cash Alliance. It's run by the United Nations. They have corporate partners and non-profit partners and governmental partners, and they're all working very hard to try to make cash obsolete. And I think that's very dangerous, and we can run a rearguard action there. We can defend that. And we've had some successes. The city of Philadelphia recently passed an ordinance requiring stores there to accept cash. You've probably seen stores that say, we don't accept cash here. I see less of them in Oregon. I'm happy to move here. It's been a pleasure. But certainly when I was in New York, there were plenty of stores that wouldn't take any physical cash. And the city of Philadelphia just said, we're not going to do that. Just like we've started to ban facial recognition software. We can use the power of law to say this is not the direction we want society to go in. But the other part of it is to have that affirmative vision. It's to be very clear that when it comes to digital fiat currency, when it comes to the future of our public money, we do want to lead into the future. We don't want to be fuddy-duddies standing there and saying, oh, all this new tech, we don't like any of it. Right? Don't cede the future to others. But to have a vision that is egalitarian and democratic and respectful of civil liberties. And that starts with privacy and it starts with access. So to me, there was a point in history, less so recently, unfortunately, sadly, where the post office wouldn't read your mail, or it wouldn't scan your mail, or it wouldn't look inside. And that was a big deal. It was a big deal that they would actually provide this as a public service and not assume that it's their right to look what's going on inside. And we could have a system of public money where that's the case too, where we aren't looking inside what you do with your money, it's yours. And that's, it's going to allow some bad things to happen. Just like having water in the pipes means that terrorists get to drink water. We don't say we should cut off all the water to all the pipes and monitor everyone in case they might access, they might be able to drink water. Well, we can do that. We can make money that kind of resource, that it's above that kind of manipulation for narrow political or social ends, and make it as universal as we want it to be. But being conscious about it, knowing these debates are happening. And the last little point on that is, you probably haven't even heard of the term digital fiat currency, because the more common term that I don't like and I try not to use is central bank digital currency. That's the one that you hear out in the news, CBDC. Say that 10 times fast. But the reason people use that term is because, again, central bankers were very fast off the bat in making sure that when this conversation started to form, that it took place on their terms. The first thing they say is it's going to be central bank digital currency. We don't know what it's going to look like. We don't know what shape it's going to take, but the one thing we know is we're going to be in charge of it. And this takes us back to that Henry Ford idea. If you ask central bankers what they want from a digital currency, they'll say a better bank account. And if you ask them what they think about civil liberties, they'll say, look, I don't really care. I didn't do a PhD in macroeconomics to become a freedom fighter. If the FBI called me and say it needs a backdoor, well, fine. It's not my fight, not my hill to die on. And I think then that if that may be true, then they aren't the ones who should be leading this charge, or at least they shouldn't be the only ones in the room. So I would say, hopefully, call your representatives, try to get more conversations in the press, try to bring up conversations with your colleagues and friends, but we can do more. We can dream bigger for the future of money than just a slightly better bank account plus spying all the time.
I appreciate that. And I kind of want to switch a little bit to some of the questions that have been coming in from folks. One of them is, how will we pay, for example, property or income taxes using one or another of the digital currencies? And how will governments meet their financial obligations, i.e. Social Security, in this new world?
Yeah, so on the first question, the reality of tax enforcement is that most of it is through spontaneous compliance. It isn't through people sort of chasing down your door. But if we do want to go after the tax havens and the tax shelters around the world, it's really less a matter of currency and more a matter of A, enforcing the laws, and B, not allowing those shelters to exist. The reason that Caribbean nations, or North Dakota, that recently came out as a major, I think it was North Dakota, maybe South Dakota, is a major tax haven in the Pandora Papers, or the reason Switzerland is allowed to continue to act the way it is because everybody else tacitly endorses it. So I've proposed, for example, if we really wanted to deal with tax cheats, billionaires who are not paying taxes, or some, Russian oligarch who's squirreling away, state oil company money or something, we could simply say, unless you declare your funds above $10 million, we won't enforce any property rights on them. Let people steal it. Let every hacker on the planet go after you as much as you want. And my guess is that those people would suddenly come rushing very quickly asking for help. Because when you've got that much to lose, you rely on state enforcement and protection more than vice versa. The average person, I think, again, as I said, most people don't want to risk going to jail for property tax, for tax evasion and things like that. And when it comes to how we design those systems, there's still a role for good old-fashioned police work and investigation services and things, and we could just try funding the IRS properly for a change. On the question of how the government meets their financial obligations, this is actually a really interesting question, because one of the problems right now, and this is a common problem with areas that change, over time technologically, is that a lot of our legal and rhetorical frameworks and institutions are built around a monetary system that no longer exists. People sort of famously talk about the War of 1812. The Battle of New Orleans happens after the war is over because nobody got the memo, right? Well, there are situations where we have practices and we have certain kinds of instruments and certain language that come from an era when money was attached to a gold standard. And in that world, there is a big difference between government money and government debt. The reason there's a difference is when you have government currency under a gold standard, at least until 1935, when FDR suspended domestic convertibility, you could demand that that be converted into gold. So if the government issued more Federal Reserve notes, they had to make sure they had enough gold in reserve to meet that demand, or they would have to potentially change the ratio of gold convertibility, etc. And so if you could finance your deficit spending from the government via issuing treasury debt, treasury securities, rather than currency, the benefit was that you didn't have to immediately have as much gold on hand. If you issue 30 years treasury debt, then at the end of 30 years, maybe you need to have gold available, but not in the meantime. We have not lived in that system since at least 1973, when Nixon closed the international gold window and suspended convertibility of the US dollar into gold internationally. At that time, since then, and arguably since 1935, the US dollar is backed exclusively by the full faith and credit of the United States. It is an obligation, legally speaking, you can look it up in the US Code, is an obligation of the United States, and it promises what? It promises tax relief. It is a tax credit at its heart. The US dollar is a legal liability settlement credit. And what that means is, and this is counterintuitive, so bear with me, is that money is a form of debt. And conversely, government debt is a form of money. So right now, we often think of running a deficit as something that is unsustainable. We're spending beyond our means. We're borrowing from our grandchildren. But another way to think of it is we're running a deficit, that is to say we're spending $100, we're taxing 50, and the difference is made up by issuing something into the economy. That thing used to be a piece of paper, now it's a digital account entry, but we could call that debt or we could call that money. And understanding that what we call it there doesn't really change very much allows us to understand that in fact we've always been printing the deficit. We've always been funding the deficit by issuing new forms of financial instruments. It's just that we have been using a language that draws a very strict separation between money on one hand and debt on the other. That does not actually hold, certainly not since 1973. And today, as I like to sort of say to my students, we actually talked about money on Monday, if you have a $100 bill and you take it into the bank and you ask for change, what will they give you? 5 $20 bills. If you have $100 in treasury debt and it comes due, it matures, what does the government owe you? It owes you 5 $20 bills. So those two instruments, the $100 bill originally and the $100 of treasury debt, give you the same thing. And this is why if you are at Goldman Sachs and you're in their treasury department, or if you're a big pension fund manager or something and you've got a cash account, 9 times out of 10 when someone says, oh, what's your cash balance? You're talking about treasury debt. You're talking about 3-month treasury bills. You're not talking about coins, certainly. You're not talking even about $100 bills. You're talking about treasury debt because for those big institutional investors, you're thinking of money as treasury debt. One of the things that always stuck with me was people said, the poorer you are, the more money looks tangible. The richer you are, the more abstract it becomes. When you're very poor, you're dealing with little pieces of metal. When you're in the middle, you're dealing with paper money. When you get a little bit higher, you're dealing with bank accounts. And when you're dealing with very high numbers, big numbers with lots of zeros, you're dealing with bonds and stocks and all those kinds of things. They're still money. They just operate at a different level of the building. You're up in the penthouse suite when you're dealing with that. So right now, the way that we meet our obligations is we create instruments and finance the government. In a digital world, that's the same thing. We'll just call them a digital coin instead of a digital treasury debt. But there won't be any difference economically. We're certainly not borrowing from China or anything like that. In fact, I think we might actually have a renaissance of understanding about money when we move to a world in which that kind of from thin air idea is normalized.
Yeah. I want to recognize that we're at time, but if we can do it very quickly, there are two other questions from the audience before we do final thoughts and our closeout. Our next question, could you say more about why it's impossible that a private currency could replace a public currency? While it sounds far-fetched, it doesn't immediately strike as an impossibility.
Yeah, no, great question. Thank you. So the starting point here is to remember that if you have a private, commercial system, you have a lot of legal institutions. We often forget about them, and this is why I started with that Rilke quote. Don't be confused by the surfaces. There's law underneath, right? Which is that um, you need contracts, you need property laws, you need corporate laws, you need accounting laws, you often need financial laws around collateral and financial market actors. All of those things require a legal system. They require some sort of judges or some sort of dispute resolution. They require some sort of regime to set those laws. Otherwise, you have roving bands of, mafiosos shooting each other to enforce things. And it costs resources to enforce that. Judges aren't free. Certainly lawyers aren't free. I'm here to tell you that. And, the Congress isn't free. The military isn't free. The public schools aren't free. The social workers aren't free. So how do you provision yourself? Well, you need to impose obligations on actors, and whatever you choose to accept in payment becomes the form of public money. If you create a private thing out there, whether it's gold bars, and then you put this king stamp on it, say these are the official ones we'll accept, not those ones, but these ones, that's gone from being a lump of metal to being public money. If you go to Chuck E. Cheese tokens and you put President Obama's face on them and say, okay, now we're accepting these in payment of taxes, that's gone from being a private token to public money. If you take those bank deposits, those bank IOUs, they go from being a private instrument to something that has a public nature to them. And the challenge of trying to imagine a world where the private currency replaces public currency is the government still has to provision itself. It still has to enforce laws. So you have two private actors, they have a dispute, they go to court, the court says the judgment is for $10,000. What is acceptable? What can you satisfy that court judgment with? Whatever the answer is, will become the new center of the public monetary regime. There are countries that have multiple monies. You can turn something that was private into public. You can accept multiple different currencies. But what you can't do is say, I'm going to create a market, an economy, and then I'm just going to take out the public authority. It doesn't work. The actual market itself is a creature of public governance, even though we don't often think of it that way. And because of that, the public authority's monetary acceptance becomes central to any monetary regime thereafter.
Final question of the day before we wrap up is, what is the roadmap or the way to ensure that institutions don't abuse these digital currencies? When we think of manipulation of prices based on large block trades or other mechanisms that people could use to really mess with things in a way that would damage.
Yeah, it's a great question. There's a lot of talk right now about regulating and enforcing through the securities regulation framework to get the SEC to step up to the plate and sort of do their job a little bit more and actually bring some enforcement actions and to provide some clarity and regulatory guidance. And I think that's all important. But I actually think that the reality is that the edges of private finance always end up bleeding into casino-like behavior. There is a spectrum between legitimate, official financial activity and that kind of activity. And it's very hard to find a single line to cut down the middle and say, okay, this is a hard distinction. But what we have managed to do throughout history is create a distinction between the kinds of instruments that most regular people use as money and the kind of instruments that people use as investment assets, as speculative assets. And the bigger challenge today, I think, is actually not in the realm of securities and speculative assets. It's in the realm of the day-to-day stuff we use as money, whether that's PayPal or Venmo, or it's the stable coins, which are the sort of shadow money for the crypto system because it walks and talks like it's a regular dollar. It's not a Bitcoin denominated asset. It's not an Ethereum denominated asset. It's designed to be kind of like a shadow bank account that you can use in crypto spaces where the banks won't let you use your regular bank account. That's the weak point. That's the actual source of the major systemic risk. If you go gambling in a casino, if you gamble in the stock market, in some respects, you're taking on that risk that volatility will exist. The times when it's really hurt at a system wide level is when people had money in instruments they thought were safe and they turned out to not be safe, where they thought were stable and they turned out to not be stable. And there's a reason why, even in securities regulation land, if an instrument or a practice is already being regulated by bank regulations, even if they would otherwise qualify for securities regulation, the standing doctrine is that bank regulation trumps securities regulation. And I think that makes sense as a sort of hierarchy of importance. So I would say the starting point is to make sure that the actors engaging in basic monetary functions, not speculative investment functions, not things that look more like stocks or securities or anything like that, including speculative artworks. That's the whole NFT world. A colleague of mine, a law professor named Brian Fry, has a great article where he says, look, we've always been speculating in the art market. This is no different. And I agree with him. But there's a reason why art market speculation hasn't caused, global systemic financial crises, right? So I don't have a problem with the NFT world existing, but I do have a problem with people thinking that that kind of world is the future of money itself. We want money to be boring. We want money to be as vanilla as the dollar bill. And if we had a digital, vanilla, privacy-respecting dollar bill and a public bank account, no-frills checking account like the kind that the state of California just authorized, or that federal legislators are talking about with the postal finance, then I think that this kind of stuff over in the casino world, we can almost not let loose, but it wouldn't have the risk of coming to the center of our economy in the same way, and we could shrink its risk surface to a level that would allow us to meaningfully grapple with the cutting edge aspects of it without sort of killing the entire industry in the crib. But at the moment, it's somewhere between letting online coders and people on Reddit run the nuclear, have the nuclear codes or run nuclear safety inspections, and that is dangerous. That is the first order safety and systemic risk concern, in my opinion.
I appreciate that. As we wrap up, do you have any final things you'd like to share with our audience before we close out for the evening?
I mean, first of all, thanks for listening. This is a pretty dense topic, but I hope, I'm not trying to give you only one way of thinking about these things, but trying to sort of maybe identify things that you might not hear in the regular media analysis of these issues. And hopefully you can keep in mind as you're hearing these things, does this fit into a war on cash? Is this really actually privacy respecting, or is that a useful selling point to sell this token to make some cheap dollars, and the minute it stops becoming profitable, the privacy narrative will fall to the wayside? Is this really the kind of thing that I would want to trust mission critical infrastructure with, or do we need to think about that a little bit differently? And I think, if we have more people asking those kinds of questions and making sure our policymakers and our media is asking those questions, we can, make the right kinds of decisions now for future generations and for the network society that we're building.
Professor Rohan Gray, I appreciate that so much. For those of you still online with us, I want to let you know that he has a book coming out in the near future, Digitizing the Dollar, The Battle for the Soul of Public Money in the Age of Cryptocurrency. I know you probably heard some of the threads, that are probably discussed in that book during our conversation. But again, Professor, we really appreciate your time and insights into this important topic, and we look forward to bringing you back in the future. And for those of you online, if you enjoyed this this conversation, we encourage you to check out the WooStream playlist on Willamette's YouTube channel. We'd love to hear your suggestions for other alumni, faculty topics that we could feature. And please know you're always welcome to email us at alumni@willamette.edu with your ideas and suggestions and feedback. Until then, we hope that you all are staying well, and we look forward to seeing you online sometime soon. Take care, everyone.